Under new plans reportedly being drawn up by officials.
This comes as the government faces criticism for allowing travellers into the country without health checks. Joining us now, travel journalist Simon Calder, who says we don't need any restrictions. Aviation analyst Alex Macheras, who thinks it's appalling there has been no testing or quarantine for those coming into the country, and Professor Devi Sridhar, who says it's a good idea, but she's surprised it wasn't put in place weeks ago.
Let's bring in Alex Macheras. Alex, you're in Doha. You're an aviation analyst. So you've been watching, and I actually became aware of you on Twitter from very detailed stuff that you were putting out about how we were responding to this in terms of allowing people to fly in compared to other countries. What's been your overview of what the UK has done in comparison to most other places?
The UK's approach has been labelled as extraordinary, and that is because not just since the World Health Organization declared this as a global health emergency, but even then when it upgraded to pandemic status, still today you can continue to fly into the UK with no checks, no measures, no screening, no tests, and no quarantine. And this is much unlike the majority of the rest of the world. We are not just talking about nations that are quite different to the UK, like New Zealand, for example, but we're talking about nations as close to the UK as, for example, Germany. And the UK say that they are following the science, but it begs the question as to what science does the UK have access to that seemingly the rest of the world either do not have access to or are simply not following. And that's because 90% of the world's population are now living in countries where there are measures and restrictions on passengers arriving through those airports. The UK is not part of that 90%. 40% of the world's population are now living in countries that are entirely closed off to all foreign visitors. The UK is not part of that 40% either. So to be now almost in May and hear that the government are, quote, considering quarantine measures that have already been implemented for months across the world, and the UK still to think they are some kind of exception during a lockdown does seem extraordinary. And we know that this hasn't gone down well with everybody because we have the CEO of Heathrow Airport himself who has written to Matt Hancock to question why his hub airport has been left totally exposed to any incoming arrivals throughout this entire period. It was the law was set down tighter for those wishing to take a trip to the supermarket, when actually today I can still very much fly a day trip to Iran, for example, one of the countries that has been ravaged by coronavirus, and walk in straight onto the tube, straight into the supermarket, and even back to work if I'm unable to work from home. And that does just seem a huge error on the UK's government side that has already been echoed and been met by disbelief by the majority of the industry.
Really interesting. You know, when I hear that, what I think's been lacking here in the UK response has been just a basic common sense. This constant refrain from every minister and the Prime Minister, we're following the science, following the science, following the science, has given an implication that a small group of scientists who have been outliers in much of the advice they've been giving have been dictating government policy, when it just seems if 90% of the world is operating quite strict measures at airports, it makes no sense to me on a common sense level that the UK has chosen not to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, and I think there's, two things that are frustrating. One is the idea that there is some kind of the science or the evidence. If you work in academia and you work on a daily, basis as a researcher, there's no such thing as one kind of truth, right? There's different methods of interrogating questions, different pieces of evidence you bring, and often competing views when there's so much